They were never supposed to be found. Not the journals, not the cellar, not the bones, and certainly not the list. Before we drag open the rotting door to this lost chapter of American history, do one thing. Subscribe, like, and share this video with someone who thinks they know what evil looks like. Because this is not a tale of shadows. This is a tale of smiling faces, warm meals, and blood-soaked fields beneath them. Welcome to Blackridge Hollow. Year, 1809. A settlement so small, most maps never bother to name it. A place whispered about in courtrooms, pulpits, and army tents, and then deliberately erased. At its heart stood the Breckenwald farm. 400 acres of fertile ground nestled between timber ridgelines and forgotten creeks. It was paradise for the early settlers. Generous yields, clean water, thick forest, and no prying eyes. A gift from God, or something older. Owned by Elias Breckenwald, a Civil War veteran before there was even a Civil War. He had returned from frontier militia service with a broken leg and an iron stare. His wife, Tabitha, claimed Cherokee blood, though no one from the Cherokee nations ever claimed her. Together with their 3 adult sons, Uriah, Eli, and Abram, they ran the farm with discipline that bordered on militaristic. Visitors would remark on how orderly the household seemed. No laughter, no idle hands, no unlocked doors. But the Breckenwalds were famous for something else. Hospitality. Travelers said they offered hot meals, warm beds, and care for the sick. Men trudging west with bleeding feet would wake to bandaged heels and fresh stew. Women spoke of the daughter, Margaret, who sang hymns while tending to the injured. But none of them stayed long, and some of them never left at all. The first whispers came in the form of letters. Notes scratched on scraps of hide or tucked inside the linings of jackets. Do not stop at the Breckenwalds. Their kindness has teeth. But by the time authorities took notice, it was too late. Because what the Breckenwalds had built was not a farm. It was a harvesting ground, and the crop wasn't corn. The earliest confirmed disappearance linked to the Breckenwald farm occurred on April 3, 1809. A Union surveyor named Nathaniel Rusk was traveling alone, hired by the New Land Commission to chart the unexplored edges of Virginia's western frontier. His notes, detailed and meticulous, ended abruptly at the edge of Blackridge Hollow. His final entry, still preserved in the Commission archives, reads only, "They offer me supper. The daughter sings hymns." His horse was found a week later near Hollow Creek, bloodied but alive. The saddle had been removed, but the maps, compass, and Rust's case journal were all gone. No body was ever found. The farm claimed he had never arrived. But the story that truly unraveled the veil didn't come from lawmen. It came from a runaway. Her name was Dinah Crowell, 17, half-starved, and barefoot when she collapsed at the gates of Fort Everton, 20 miles from Blackridge, eyes wide with the kind of fear men don't learn from wolves. She was not a traveler. She had been a servant. For 3 years, Dinah lived in the root cellar of the Breckenwald home, fed just enough to work, beaten when she spoke out of turn, and never permitted to step outside unless escorted. She said there were others, not just laborers but prisoners. Men, women, a boy whose tongue had been cut out. None of them locals, all of them travelers. According to her testimony, the Breckenwalds ran the farm like a machine. Elias, the father, kept meticulous records in a leather-bound ledger. Names, dates, weights, notes about the health of stock. The sons were assigned roles. Eli lured victims with charm and Margaret's angelic hymns. Abram dug the graves. Uriah handled the livestock and the others. Dinah's most chilling accusation, however, wasn't about the killings. It was about the room, below the house, behind a false wall in the cellar. A room she called the Silence. No one screamed in there. Not because they were gagged, but because of what happened after. Every person who entered the Silence either never came out, or came out changed. Hollow-eyed, silent forever, or violently mad. Dinah's story was dismissed, of course. Just a hysterical girl. Until the second girl showed up with the same story. And that's when people started digging. The second girl's name was Annabeth Lyle, and her arrival shattered any remaining illusions of innocence in Blackridge Hollow. She stumbled into the county seat 2 months after Dinah's escape. escorted by a trapper who found her wandering the forest in nothing but a shift and a rusted iron collar. Her hands were bruised. Her tongue had been partially severed, and she carried a rolled scrap of linen that no one could decipher until they soaked it in vinegar and held it to flame. Under the soot and blood, a map emerged. Crude, but unmistakable. A layout of the Breckenwald estate. Barn, smokehouse, cellar, and a hand-drawn X behind the western orchard. Underneath it, scrawled in shaking script. They eat what they grow, but not all of it is grown. Annabeth couldn't speak clearly, but what little she could communicate matched Dinah's testimony point for point. The room, the ledgers, the disappearances. She drew the same crude spiral symbol Dinah had carved onto her bed frame in Fort Everton. A circular blade with 13 notches, what later investigators call the harvest sigil. Authorities could no longer claim coincidence. A militia was dispatched. 25 armed men under the command of Lieutenant Alden Cray, a veteran of Indian campaigns and well-versed in rural warfare. The Breckenwalds were not warned. They wanted the element of surprise. They arrived before dawn, but the farm was empty. No livestock, no bodies, no Breckenwalds. The fields had been torched. The house was cold, the doors open, and yet the cellar was locked from the inside. It took axes to break through. What they found beneath would take decades to catalog and centuries to forget. The root cellar descended farther than any had expected. A winding stone tunnel, impossibly deep, branching into chambers. Each room held objects, some human, some not. Bones, tools, implements made of copper and hide. Symbols carved into walls with precision that suggested mathematics rather than mysticism. And, at the very end, the silence. Just as Dinah had described. The walls were padded. The air was thick. And in the center, a chair bolted to the floor, surrounded by mirrors angled inward. There were chains, yes, but not for restraint, for positioning, for exposure. A ritual chamber disguised as a restraint room, and etched into the ceiling above the chair, the harvest sigil, burned deep into the stone. The men who entered the silence that morning didn't speak of what they saw in detail. Not to their wives, not to their commanders, not to the newspapers that came begging with coin and threats. But something changed in them. You could see in their eyes afterward, hollow, rimmed with red, always scanning corners that didn't exist. Lieutenant Cray resigned his commission 2 days later. He burned his uniform in the courthouse square. The official report he submitted was 6 pages long and full of contradictions. First, he claimed there were 14 bodies, then scratched it out to say none were identifiable. At one point, he wrote, "Some of the remains had eyes. Still open. Still wet." That line was blacked out in the final report. Of the 25 men who entered the cellar, 9 were dead within a year. Not from wounds or illness, from suicide, from vanishing without trace, or from inexplicable accidents that left no witnesses. One man walked into his own corn thresher. Another wandered into the woods and was found kneeling in a dry creek bed, eyes gouged out, mouth stuffed with dirt. Locals began whispering that the silence was not just a room, but a thing, a presence, a mouth that still hung open, waiting for more. And just as fast as it had surfaced, the story vanished. Washington sent a team of federal men, dressed not in uniforms but in suits. They spoke Latin and carried wax-sealed crates. They took the ledger. They sealed the cellar. They erased names. They threatened anyone who spoke to the press with charges of treason, sedition, even heresy, as if they were operating under a different kind of law altogether. And then they made the Breckenwald estate disappear. Not just the house, the land. It no longer appeared on maps. The deeds were revoked. When one family tried a homestead near Hollow Creek 10 years later, they were gone by winter. No forwarding address. No sale notice. Just their cabin, burned black, door chained shut from the outside. But the most disturbing detail came in 1843, 34 years later. A traveling preacher from Ohio claimed he had found Elias Breckenwald, alive, in South Carolina, leading a congregation. He wore the same boots. He used the same phrases. And in the center of the church altar hung the sigil, The preacher's name was given as Brother Eli. He wore all black and carried no Bible, only a pocket ledger bound in pale leather. His followers claimed he could cure barrenness, silence illness, and read the memory of the soil. But when someone asked where he'd learned these gifts, he simply answered, "The earth speaks if you know how to feed it." The man was gaunt but tall, with sunken eyes and a voice like boiled molasses. The children in the congregation weren't allowed to speak in public. The women wore collars of hemp, and none of them ever ventured into town without gloves. But the most unsettling detail came from the traveling merchant who'd passed through every 3 months. He noticed that every time he visited the town near Pine Hollow, it had fewer dogs, then fewer cats. Then, in the final trip he ever made there, fewer children. One local boy named Isaac disappeared in early spring. The sheriff organized a search. For 3 days, they combed the woods until they found the boy's boot. Just the boot, sitting neatly on the steps of Brother Eli's church. No sign of struggle. No blood. No prints. But inside the boot was a note. 6 words, written in a hand no one could identify. The field was hungry. He fed it. That very night, the church was burned down by townspeople. But no bodies were recovered from the ashes. Not of the children. Not of Brother Eli. Not of anyone. All that remained was the stone foundation and a single iron chair, embedded in the dirt under what used to be the altar. It matched the design from the cellar back in Blackridge Hollow. Identical angles, same bowl placement. And carved into its backrest, behind flaking black paint. To see is to feed. For a moment, lawmen and locals alike considered that Elias Breckenwald, or whatever he had become, might not have been just a man at all, but the harbinger of something older. Something that used men as vessels. Something ritualistic. Something tied to cycles far more ancient than the church itself. And what's worse, there were similar cases. In Kansas. In Louisiana. In the Dakotas. All places where farms failed but bodies multiplied. The pattern was undeniable. Rural towns. Isolated farms. Families that vanished. Soil that grew strangely fertile, then suddenly barren, as if something had fed too much, too fast. In 1814, 5 years after the Blackridge Hollow incident, another case surfaced in Coffee County, Kansas. Locals spoke of the Pharaoh farm, where livestock would wander off and return skinned, but still breathing. The farmhouse itself was said to hum at night. Witnesses described strange lights beneath the floorboards and voices whispering beneath the fields. The patriarch, Everett Pharaoh, had moved there from Maryland with 5 sons. Within 2 seasons, all 5 were dead, one drowned in the well, another impaled on a fence post, and the rest locked in the root cellar with their mouths sewn shut. When questioned, Everett only said, "They knew too much. The land told them things a man shouldn't hear." By the time authorities arrived, Everett was gone. The entire cellar had collapsed into a sinkhole that reeked of rot and ash. But a symbol was found carved into a surviving beam. The same angular sigil from the Breckenwald ledger. Identical strokes. Same unnatural symmetry. And then in 1821, a missionary in Louisiana claimed to have uncovered a circle of believers who refer to themselves as the Threshers. They operated on an old sugarcane plantation, long abandoned after a fire wiped out the original owners. These Threshers believed that sacrifice to the earth could reveal forgotten knowledge, what they called deep grain. The missionary was burned alive in his quarters. His journal, however, survived. In it he wrote, "They're feeding something beneath the roots. Not God, not devil, something older, something that smells like soil and iron." No one prosecuted the killings. In fact, no one from the surrounding counties even acknowledged them, as if the events themselves had been swallowed whole by the ground, like everything else connected to the sigil. And then came the Hollow Creek mass vanishings in 1827. Over 40 people gone. No signs of struggle. No fires. No blood. But on the town's only well, a phrase was scorched into the wood with an unknown substance. What's buried is never dead. It's waiting. What had started with the Breckenwalds was spreading up. By 1830, whispers of the Breckenwalds had turned to silence. The region around Blackridge Hollow was avoided entirely. The mapmakers of the time, both government and private, began omitting the town from new prints. And yet, strange documents continued surfacing in estate sales and library attics. Ledger books, crop records, even fragments of letters written in a cryptic dialect that no one could fully translate. One such letter was recovered in 1832 from an abandoned mill outside of Daggermore. The parchment was aged, brittle, and soaked with a dark reddish stain. It bore no signature, only a phrase at the top written in sharp, deliberate strokes. The throat of the earth is opening again. What followed was a detailed account of a ritual, not a sacrifice, but a feeding. The writer spoke of placing objects into the ground, not bodies, but memories, a child's doll, a mother's braid, the severed finger of a dying priest. These offerings, it claimed, were consumed not by beasts, but by a living chamber beneath the hollow. And worse, it answered. Farmers in that area had already reported strange tremors at night. The soil would shudder, not from quakes, but like something shifting deep below. Crops would grow faster than normal. Some pigs birthed litters with too many legs. And in every barn with animals that turned strange, the same symbol was found burned into the wood, the sigil from the Breckenwald cellar. Then came a visitor, a young woman named Agnes Duval, posing as a traveling herbalist, began going door to door in neighboring towns, offering tinctures to barren women. Records show that nearly a dozen accepted her help, and within a year, not one of those children lived past age 5. They died with the same look in their eyes, wide, black, and utterly still. One undertaker reportedly quit after burying the 4th child. His note simply read, "I know what they look like. These weren't born. They were grown." Duval vanished shortly after. But investigators later found a journal in her rented room, detailing an attempted resurrection, not of a person, but of a cycle, a harvest of blood and memory. She referred to the Breckenwald farm as the original mouth, and according to her final page, the mouth is never closed. It only sleeps. In the winter of 1834, a reclusive antiquarian named Thaddeus Merck compiled a personal dossier on the Breckenwalds, Hollow Creek, and the Thresher cult. His findings, mostly handwritten, were hidden inside a false wall in his study, discovered only decades later by a restoration crew. Among the yellowed pages was a diagram that chilled even the most hardened archivists. It was a map, but not a map of towns or counties. This was a web, jagged lines drawn from farm to farm, each one marked with a carved, inked circle. Each location, according to Merck's notes, was a former agricultural site with a history of disappearances, fires, or unexplained disease. At the center of the map, Blackridge Hollow. He labeled it plainly, the root. What Thaddeus Merck seemed to be suggesting was not just a series of random atrocities, but a deliberate network. A kind of subterranean system where memory, death, and ritual were being funneled into something deeper, something ancient. The most disturbing part? Every 18 years, the same pattern emerged again. A new family, a new farm, a new harvest. In 1836, this cycle hit a small orchard outside of Gristmill. The Doverson family, newly settled, deeply religious, and completely unaware of the land's history. By the 3rd summer, their youngest boy began speaking in full Latin, despite never having been taught the language. He recited entire biblical passages backward. He refused to sleep indoors. He began drawing that same twisted sigil in pig's blood on the barn floor. Local clergy were called. The boy was taken. No exorcism was ever officially recorded, but the priest who led the rite was later found hanged inside the bell tower of St. Mere's Parish. Eyes burned black, hands blistered. The orchard, abandoned ever since, still bears fruit. But no one picks it. They say it tastes of ash and iron. At this point in the story, if you're still with us, you can feel it, can't you? There is something wrong beneath these farms. If you're watching this right now, comment the phrase, "The root is awake." Again, comment, "The root is awake." Because the more we dig, the closer we get to what was meant to stay buried. The name Breckenwald slowly disappeared from legal documents after 1840. Land records were scrubbed. Family trees were broken off midline. Local officials claimed fires had destroyed much of Blackridge Hollow's documentation, a convenient excuse that was repeated in at least 4 surrounding counties. But privately, among archivists and gravekeepers, the name still lingered. In 1843, a tomb was discovered beneath the collapsed remains of a chapel on the outskirts of Blackridge Hollow. What made it unusual wasn't its size, but its design. The walls were not made of stone, but of compressed soil, tightly packed and etched with thousands of claw-like scrapes. It had no coffins, no remains. Instead, at its center stood a crude wooden effigy, a figure with no face, arms outstretched, its hands holding what appeared to be a sack of dried corn and a child's leather shoe. Beneath it, a message carved into the dirt. All harvests are bought in flesh. An investigator from Graymoor University, Dr. Elias Farron, documented the discovery in his personal journal. He believed it was a ritual chamber tied to what he called the agrarian death cult, a theory he would later die trying to prove. Farron believed that groups like the Breckenwalds weren't just killers. They were part of an intergenerational machine designed to extract memory and life from rural populations and feed it into a metaphysical system beneath the earth. He believed this network extended not just through Blackridge Hollow, but across the entire eastern seaboard, with farms, churches, and orphanages all acting as nodes in an invisible design. But shortly after publishing a draft of his theory, Dr. Farron was found dead in his home, drowned in his own well. The sheriff ruled it suicide. But the final page of his journal told another story. "I saw it," he wrote. "It opened its eyes in the mud, and it smiled." What terrified Farron most was not the physical evidence, but what the victims had seen before death. He collected letters, final scribbles from mothers, children, even priests. Each described the same hallucination. A giant mouth beneath the barn, chewing, remembering, wanting more. The Breckenwalds were gone, but the feeding had not stopped. And according to Farron, it never would. In the spring of 1846, an aging farmhand named Linus Crow walked into the Blackridge Hollow Sheriff's office, barefoot, bleeding from the mouth, and carrying a bundle of stained children's clothes. He collapsed without saying a word. What followed was a fevered, rambling confession. 47 hours of near-constant muttering and shaking, transcribed by 3 separate clerks before he died of what was described only as cerebral rupture. What he confessed to was not murder, but memory harvesting. Crow claimed that the Breckenwald family, or what he called the elders in skin, used him and others as vessels. Tools. He said the farm was not for crops or animals, but for capturing moments of fear, bottling them, and burying them in the soil like seeds. He described long nights spent dragging half-conscious orphans into the root cellar, placing metal rods behind their eyes, and reciting incantations taught to him in his dreams. He said he never remembered the faces, just the sounds they made when the wind passed through their mouths. The sheriff laughed it off. Locals called it the ravings of a madman. But one clerk didn't. Jonathan Trellick, just 24 at the time, took the transcripts home and began researching every name Crow mentioned. What he discovered was horrifying. Every person listed, from children to farm staff, had indeed existed and had all vanished without a trace between 1809 and 1821. Even worse, each name had also appeared in a local newspaper obituary, not once but twice. One in the year they disappeared, and again years later. Same name, same face, different location, different death. Trellick believed the Breckenwalds were reusing identities, or worse, recycling the dead. He began digging in cemeteries near the farm, especially around those marked with foundling or charity burial. Most coffins contained dirt. One contained bones, but they were all jawbones. Just the jaws. In his final notes before he vanished, Trellick wrote, "The Breckenwalds never die. They just change names, and the land remembers for them." That line would become a whispered legend in Blackridge Hollow. Mothers spoke it when their children sleepwalked toward the cornfields, and in one rare case, carved it into a tree, backward. By 1850, the region around Blackridge Hollow had become a blind spot on government maps. Roads that once led and were rerouted. Trains passed it without whistle or stop. Letters sent to its remaining residents were returned unopened, or worse, arrived again with no handwriting, only a faint black fingerprint pressed into the paper. That year, a team of 3 civil engineers from Holloway County were sent to chart the old Breckenwald property for possible sale. What they found was not a farm, but a wound in the earth. The house was gone, not collapsed, but vanished as if pulled beneath the ground. The fields were overgrown with vegetation that no botanist could identify, red-black stalks that bled when cut and turned to ash in sunlight. There were no animals, no birds, not even insects. At the center of the property, they found what appeared to be a spiral trench, almost 60 feet wide, carved into the soil like a whirlpool. Inside were thousands of small wooden figures, each with a child's shoe nailed to its back. One of the engineers, Henry Draves, attempted to sketch what he saw, but the moment he put pencil to paper, his hands seized. His eyes rolled back, and for 10 minutes, he screamed the same sentence over and over. "The harvest is behind us now. We must return what we stole." Draves was institutionalized 3 days later. When questioned, he claimed he could see everyone who had ever died on the Breckenwald land, and what they looked like now. He drew dozens of portraits. Every face was stretched into something wrong. Insect-like, toothless, eyeless, smiling. In the bottom corner of every sketch, Draves wrote the same word. Below, the other 2 engineers never returned to work. One cut out his own tongue and buried it under his floorboards. The other simply disappeared. His boots were later found at the edge of the spiral, filled with blood but no body. By the following spring, no one would accept contracts to survey the land. The local priest said it best. That place doesn't want to be seen. It wants to be remembered. And in Blackridge Hollow, memory always has a price. In 1851, a traveling photographer named Elias Braith claimed he was offered $40 and 2 nights lodging to take photographs of the old Breckenwald property. The money was more than generous, especially for a region still clawing its way out of post-war poverty. He accepted. Braith arrived with a brass-bodied daguerreotype camera, a wooden tripod, and enough silver nitrate to capture 24 images. He never made it to the farmhouse ruins. Something stopped him at the tree line. It wasn't fear. It was the sound. He described it later in his journals as a low moan, like a mother remembering a child that never lived. Still, he set up his equipment. He took the first photograph, then a second, and a third. When he developed the plates, the horror began. The first photo, the outer field, came out normal. But in the second, something appeared. Behind the spiraling trench, half concealed in the grain, stood a tall figure, 7 feet at least. Bare-skinned, no clothes, no face, just 2 slit-like indentations where the eyes should have been, and something dripping from its hands. The third photo, there was no land in it, only faces. Hundreds of screaming faces, pressed up against the lens as though the camera had somehow been placed inside the earth itself. Their mouths open, eyes missing, and each one bearing a child's shoe nailed to its forehead. Braith fled, but something followed. Over the next year, everyone who viewed those photographs reported the same thing. Their own reflection began to blur. It started in mirrors, then windows, then even puddles. Some said they saw small figures darting behind them. Others claimed their reflections smiled when they didn't. By spring, all 3 plates were stolen from the town archive. No break-in, no fingerprints, just a single black thumbprint smeared on the doorknob, pointing down. And in the weeks that followed, 7 children disappeared from the surrounding county, all under the age of 12. No signs of struggle, no broken locks. Only one thing was left behind in each case. A small, blood-stained bundle of straw, bound with dental floss. It was then that townspeople whispered a phrase that hadn't been spoken in over 20 years. The soil remembers. The disappearances reignited interest in the Breckenwald case, but no longer from local lawmen or county inspectors. This time, the visitors came from farther east, men in gray overcoats, government-issued boots, and no names. They arrived quietly. No announcements. No official jurisdiction. Just black wagons with lead-sealed trunks and crates marked only with a symbol. A tree without leaves, its roots tangled into a knot. They called themselves the Department of Agrarian Rehabilitation. But they asked no questions about crops. They demanded no ledgers, no tax records. Instead, they sought oral history, accounts of disappearances, whispers, family journals, children's nightmares. They paid large sums for artifacts from the Breckenwald farm, dolls, shoes, locks of hair. But those who sold these objects were warned never to speak of the transactions again. One farmer, Ezekiel Ward, had kept a wooden feeding trough from the property, a relic he claimed was carved from the roots of a tree that bled when chopped. He agreed to sell it. But the night after he handed it over, his entire livestock, 43 animals, were found slaughtered, tongues cut out, eyes boiled inside their sockets. On the barn wall, smeared in blood, was a single word: repent. From there, the department's presence turned violent. Homes were ransacked without warrants. Diaries confiscated. Children questioned without their parents. One old widow, who refused to part with a crude wooden toy she'd unearthed in her garden, was found dead 3 days later, her throat stuffed with mud and matchsticks. The toy was never recovered. Witnesses say that for every item taken, the officials would place something in return: stones marked with sigils or rolled sheets of parchment sealed in wax. No one dared open them. Then, just as suddenly as they arrived, the officials vanished. All records of the Department of Agrarian Rehabilitation were scrubbed for National Archives. The Breckenwald property was placed under indefinite lockdown, labeled unfit for civil or commercial use. To this day, the land is owned by no one. And yet, every October 9th, a lantern appears in the field, glowing red, moving in slow circles, as if someone or something is tending to the harvest. Locals call it the hollowing. October 9th came again, and with it the light. But this time someone followed it. A drifter named Cole Bannister had been sleeping rough near the Blackridge edge. He wasn't local, didn't know the stories. Thought the tales of the Breckenwald farm were just backwoods scare tactics, myths told to keep strangers away from good land. He saw the red lantern around midnight, thought it was a poacher, or maybe a hermit. Curiosity pushed him across the fence line, and into the soil that remembers. He followed the glow, through rotted fences, past a collapsed silo, toward what remained of the barn. Every few minutes the lantern would vanish, only to reappear 10 paces ahead, as if inviting him further. At exactly 12:33 a.m., Cole stepped on the stone ring. Buried beneath weeds and mud, it had once been a fire pit. But now it was cold, dry, surrounded by dead birds, each with their wings pinned open, as if crucified to the earth. He reached down to examine the stones. And that's when he heard the sound. Not a voice, not an animal. It was the echo of someone whispering his own name, over and over, from inside the pit. He ran. He made it 2 miles into the woods before collapsing. A family found him the next morning, shirt torn, eyes bloodshot, fingers raw from clawing at the bark. He only said one thing before he died of cardiac arrest. It had no face, but it knew my father's sins. The autopsy revealed something stranger. Inside his stomach were 4 items. A rusted child's ring engraved with the name Marla, a fingernail belonging to someone else, 2 unchewed kernels of corn, a torn page from the book of Leviticus, verse 18:21. Thou shalt not let any of thy seed pass through the fire to Molech. That verse had been missing from the church Bible in Blackridge Hollow for over 70 years. And across Cole's back, etched into his skin with perfect symmetry, were the following words, in a dialect no one could trace. The harvest will not end until the roots are burned. And yet, no one has dared dig up the Breckenwald fields. They say the ground breathes if you stand still long enough. Be why the winter of 1812, whispers about the Breckenwald land were no longer limited to ghost stories. They had entered sermons, school books, and secret councils held behind shuttered town halls. Entire generations were beginning to disappear without records, birthrights, or graves. But something more unsettling emerged. The dreams. Residents who lived within 5 miles of the old farm began reporting identical nightmares. Men, women, even children. Night after night, they all claimed to see the same sequence. A field of black corn under a purple sky. A house with no doors. A well that hissed like a serpent. And a woman standing on a tree stump, holding a severed pig's head like a lantern. She whispered one word, always the same. Descend. The dreams worsened. People began sleepwalking, sometimes for miles, often ending up at the edge of the Breckenwall property, barefoot, bleeding, and unable to remember how they got there. Some were found digging frantically into the soil with their hands, repeating phrases in dead languages. One man, Joseph Kramer, scratched an entire map of the Breckenwald estate into the walls of his home using only his teeth. That map revealed something no one had ever recorded. A second barn, far to the north, hidden by bramble and stone. No locals had spoken of it, and no records of its construction existed in county archives. But when a team of 3 investigators went searching in late December, they found it, or what remained of it, half collapsed, buried in roots and decay. The second barn held no tools, no feed, and no animals. Instead, they found 7 wooden chairs arranged in a circle, each bearing a name carved into the seat. Elijah, Miriam, Tobias, Ruth, Amos, Lydia, Caleb. In the center of the circle lay a rusted meat hook, and from every rafter above, ropes hung, all the same length, all swaying slightly, though there was no wind that day. What made the investigators flee and never return were the markings carved into the beams. A tally of 312, and above the doorway, scratched backwards into the wood in dried human blood. We feed what feeds us. If you're still watching, comment below. We feed what feeds us. Again, comment. We feed what feeds us. Let's see who's truly paying attention. There are 2 types of towns in America. Those that bury their dead, and those that bury their truths. Blackridge Hollow did both. In 1815, a group of regional clergy and Freemason affiliates arrived under the guise of conducting a spiritual audit, but they didn't visit the church. They didn't speak to the townspeople. They made their way directly to the Breckenwald farm, escorted by men with no names, only badges issued from a government office that no longer exists. They brought fire with them. Over the course of 3 nights, they set blaze to every remaining structure on the Breckenwald property, both barns, the root cellar, and the crumbled farmhouse. Witnesses claimed they poured an oil mixture that smelled nothing like kerosene. One farmer said it hissed like it was alive, but the flames wouldn't stay. 1 hour after the first fire was lit, it went cold. Smoke turned inward. Ash rained upward. And when the clergy returned in the morning, every structure stood untouched. Not a beam burned. Not a stone blackened. They tried again. This time, they built trenches, poured salt, and recited forbidden psalms once held back from standard Bibles. The result? The ground bled. Thick, red fluid poured up through the soil around the foundation stones. 2 of the men vomited black bile and collapsed. One clawed at his own face, screaming, "I can still hear them chewing." He died an hour later. Before he passed, he whispered one final sentence. "It's not the family that cursed the land. It's the land that made the family." And then, everything went silent. The clergy vanished. Their records erased. The Freemasons closed the local lodge. All legal documents regarding the Breckenwald property were sealed under a federal order known as Act 27B, stamped with the words, "Ongoing agricultural research, national security priority." The town was told to forget, and for the most part they did. But once a year on October 9th, you can still see a red lantern flickering between the dead corn stalks. No one follows it now. They know better, but the soil still remembers. Children in Blackridge Hollow began disappearing long before anyone took it seriously. One child here, another the next season, always explained away by wolves, harsh winters, or family disputes. But if you trace the pattern across decades, the truth begins to emerge like blood through gauze. They vanished in 7s. Always in 7s. No matter the year, no matter the season, every disappearance involved exactly 7 children, all under the age of 9. The local sheriff once remarked in his private journal, "It's as if someone's feeding a calendar rather than committing a crime." That journal was never made public. In fact, shortly after writing that, the sheriff himself disappeared, becoming the 8th name carved into the old courthouse steps. What investigators never revealed, or refused to admit, was that none of the parents ever heard a sound. No screaming, no broken locks, no footprints. The children were there one evening, tucked in and warm, and gone by morning. Their beds, however, were ice cold. Some mothers said the pillows had a smell, a sour, earthy scent like mold and meat. And in one case, the words brought below were scratched into the wooden wall behind a child's headboard, clawed in with fingernails or worse. Then came the dolls. Every time a group of children disappeared, a new doll would appear, handmade, carved from corn husk, with button eyes and stitched mouths. They were always found near the Breckenwald land, propped against the old fence posts facing the town, and each one had a letter burned into its chest, a single character from the old Hebrew alphabet. When stitched together in order of each abduction, the letters spelled Sel Shel Echad, the shadow of one, an ancient phrase found only in forbidden Kabbalistic texts, describing a consciousness born of blood sacrifice, bound to soil through repetition, ritual, and generational devotion. In plain English, a god made from silence, obedience, and fear. And the Breckenwalds? They weren't criminals. They were priests, caretakers of something older than sin. Older than scripture, at the center of the Breckenwald property stood a tree no one could name. It wasn't a willow. It was an oak. Its bark was the color of ash, but its sap bled crimson when cut, and when it bled, the air around it changed. The locals called it the hungering tree. According to fragments of the Breckenwald family journal, salvaged from the root cellar years later, it was planted in 1744, but no record exists of where the seed came from. The entry simply read, "The gift was given on the blackest morning. We planted it in our fear. It grew fast, too fast. By 1750, it stood higher than the church steeple. Its roots tore through stone, splitting the land like veins. Cattle refused to graze near it. Birds never landed on its branches. And every autumn, its leaves turned deep violet, not red. But what the Breckenwalds discovered beneath it changed them forever. Beneath the tree was not soil. It was flesh. During an unseasonal drought in 1773, the family dug near the base, hoping to find water. What they found instead was a layer of tissue, not stone, that bled when pierced. Beneath that, a ribcage. Beneath that, a heartbeat. According to their account, the Breckenwald patriarch passed out. The second eldest son fell into a catatonic state. The eldest daughter began speaking in Latin, a language she had never been taught, repeating a single phrase. Ego custodio carnum. I keep the flesh. The tree, they realized, was not a tree at all. It was a sentinel, grown from the exposed spine of something ancient, something that had been buried there long before the town existed. It fed not on sunlight, but on blood, on memory, on fear, and worse, it wanted a voice. So the Breckenwalds built the farm not to harvest crops, but to cultivate silence, a buffer of obedience, a routine of sacrifice, all built around keeping that thing beneath the tree asleep. But nothing sleeps forever, and by 1809, the thing had begun to stir. The dolls, the disappearances, the blood-soaked soil, they were all signs of one truth. The soil was breaking. He was a drifter, a man without roots, scars like river maps down both arms, and a voice that rasped like dried bark. Locals never knew his real name. They called him Elias the Butcher, though he hadn't touched meat in years. Elias wandered into Blackridge Hollow during the spring thaw of 1809, just weeks after the last 7 children vanished. His arrival was seen as a curse. Birds stopped chirping, the wells turned bitter, and the Breckenwald farm, which hadn't sent smoke from its chimney in days, was suddenly roaring with fire again. But Elias wasn't afraid. He carried a bag of salt, an old flintlock pistol, and an axe with Latin carved into the handle. The same phrase the Breckenwald daughter once spoke during her trance. Ego custodio carnum. I keep the flesh. Locals claim he walked straight to the hungering tree without hesitation, as if pulled. He didn't blink, didn't tremble, He raised his axe, and the ground screamed. Witnesses said the air rippled. Thunder cracked without clouds. Blood poured from cracks in the bark. But that was not the worst of it. Elias never finished the swing. His eyes rolled back, his jaw clenched, and he began muttering, first in Latin, then in tongues no one recognized, then in the voices of the missing children. 7 voices, all speaking in unison from one man's mouth. They begged him to stop. They told him they were not in pain, but in service. But they had chosen this. That Father Breckenwald showed us the truth. That the one beneath must never be starved. Elias dropped the axe and collapsed. He was found 3 days later in the chapel ruins. Eyes gouged out, fingers broken backwards, and a message burned into his chest, letter by letter. Silence is the sacrifice. The townsfolk buried him in a coffin of salt and iron, but his grave cracked open 2 weeks later. No body, just the axe standing upright in the earth, and a single doll at its base. The doll's mouth was open, and that was when they knew something had learned how to speak. It was the winter of 1821 when the town heard the knock. 3 firm raps on the chapel door, the one that had remained sealed since the fire. The priest had long since abandoned it. No one dared go near the ruins after Elias was found. But on that night, the knock came again, and standing at the door were 7 adults, dressed in black, eyes pale as ash, and identical scars across their foreheads. A perfect crescent carved deep beneath the skin. The same 7 children who had vanished 12 years prior. Only they were no longer children, and they remembered nothing. No names, no families, no past. When asked, they would tilt their heads and answer softly. We were beneath. We were fed. We were made clean. Their fingerprints matched. Their facial features had not changed. But their behavior was wrong. Robotic. Precise. They moved in synchrony, blinked in rhythm, laughed without breath. One doctor, Dr. Elwood, the town's only surgeon, examined them and made a single note in his records before resigning the next day. Their hearts are not human. They beat too slow. They beat in unison, like drums calling something back. It wasn't long before the returned 7 began walking the town at night. Never speaking, never interacting, just observing, watching homes, watching fields, watching the hungering tree. They'd stand before it for hours, rain or shine, whispering in voices too quiet to understand. At first the town thought they were victims. Then came the dreams. Dozens of locals reported nightmares of waking up underground, their arms bound in roots, a pulse in the dirt beating like thunder. Every dream ended the same, with the image of a face growing inside the hungering tree. A new face, old and young at once, and always smiling. That spring, the soil around the tree bloomed with crimson flowers. The children stood among them, heads tilted back, mouths open wide, catching something we could not see. By then, the Breckenwald name had all but vanished, but the influence had not. The farm was changing, adapting, preparing for something far older than any family. The Breckenwald ledger was locked in a cedar box beneath the floorboards of the farmhouse, wrapped in cloth, sealed in wax, and buried with 7 rusted keys, each engraved with a different sigil. No one dared open it for decades, until a man named Thomas Gallows, an amateur historian and descendant of the original constable, decided the truth was worth disturbing. Inside was no financial record, no inventory, no crop notes, no weather logs. Instead, it was a thick journal of handwritten scripture, diagrams, anatomical sketches, and what can only be described as ritual choreography. The name at the top of the first page read, "The Harvest of Silence, Year 1 of the Rooted Kingdom." It began with a doctrine, a manifesto penned by Elijah Breckenwald himself, claiming that God was not above, but below, that flesh was dead, that pain was a tithe, and that silence was the only true form of worship. The ritual, according to the pages, was to be performed every 11 years. The prime number was intentional, an unbroken rhythm that mimicked the pulse of the one beneath. 7 children were chosen, always at the peak of innocence. Not kidnapped, not taken, but offered by bloodlines marked at birth. And they were never to be killed. No, Elijah was explicit. The flesh must walk. The flesh must forget. And then, the flesh must return hollowed. Accompanying the text were symbols, rings within rings, with human shapes suspended in tangled branches. One diagram showed the exact location of a chamber beneath the hungering tree, labeled only the cradle. Inside it, the children were not harmed in the way we understand. They were reversed, stripped of memory, identity, language, until only obedience remained. Their bodies returned, but what was inside had changed. They were no longer people. They were vessels, and those vessels had a purpose: to seed the next wave, to expand the influence of the one beneath, to prepare the land for a new kind of harvest, one where the roots would feed on the forgotten. In the margins of the final page, written in a trembling hand, the tree grows faster when the world is loud. When the town forgets, the silence blooms. The storm came without warning. It was the summer of 1830, humid, tense, as if the sky itself were waiting for something to rise. The clouds cracked open with a noise that didn't sound like thunder. It was deeper, more guttural, like the groan of a dying cathedral. At the center of Blackridge Hollow, lightning struck the hungering tree. Not once, 3 times. Witnesses claimed it did not burn. It bled, a thick, dark sap oozing from the trunk that hissed when it hit the ground. But what made every man, woman, and child flee in horror wasn't the storm. It was the sound that followed. From the heart of the tree came screaming. Human, familiar, and layered. Dozens of voices stacked on top of each other, crying out in anguish. And then it split. A massive crack ran down the center of the ancient tree, splitting it open like a wound. Within the hollowed bark was not rot, but movement. Something was inside. Eliza Gormand, a midwife who lived near the edge of the farm, was the only one brave or foolish enough to approach. What she saw changed her forever. Crawling out of the tree were figures, pale, shriveled, but breathing. Their eyes sealed shut with scar tissue. Their mouths stitched but twitching. Limbs too long, fingers bent the wrong way. One by one, they slid from the tree's interior like newborns. Except they were not born. They were returned. And among them, Eliza recognized a face. Her own brother. Disappeared 18 years prior at the age of 9. He hadn't aged. When she approached, he turned his face to her, not by sound, but as if he felt her presence, and smiled. A cruel, empty smile. Then he whispered without lips, "We are all roots now." That night, the town attempted to burn the hungering tree. The flames took the bark, but the heart would not catch. And by morning, the tree was whole again. No split, no wound, no sap, as if it had healed itself. Or worse, been reborn. Deputy Aaron Wexley was no ordinary lawman. He had been a seminary student, a trained cartographer, and a self-proclaimed watchman for unnatural patterns. After witnessing the hungering tree event, he resigned from public duty and began an obsessive, self-financed investigation into what he called the second bloom. He believed what emerged from the tree were not survivors, but seeds. Wexley's private journal, locked in the archives of the Dade County Courthouse for over 140 years, was finally uncovered during restoration work in 1979. Inside were maps, diagrams, eyewitness accounts, and most disturbingly, a detailed behavioral log of the returned children. They did not integrate. They did not age. They did not sleep. Instead, they wandered, always in threes, always barefoot, walking in large, sweeping circles across the outskirts of Blackridge Hollow, as if surveying something buried deep below. They avoided the chapel. They ignored food, and they never spoke to each other, yet often moved in perfect synchrony. Wexley followed them for 10 years. In secret, always at a distance. His notes describe how every 29 days, without fail, the returned would gather at an abandoned well behind the old brick-and-walled farm. There they would stand in silence for hours, staring down into it, humming in unison. The sound was described as low and metallic, like a distant machine turning underground. One night, Wexley took a rope and descended the well. What he found below would haunt him until his death. Rough-hewn tunnels, carved by no tool he recognized. Symbols etched into the stone, identical to those in the Breckenwald ledger. And deeper in, an enormous chamber lined with human teeth. Thousands of them, arranged in concentric circles. At the center, something growing, pulsing, root-like but not wood, not plant, and not dead. Wexley wrote, "It knows I am here. It does not see. It does not speak. But it feels. It feels me like a spider waiting on a web. The returned are not lost. They are planting it, feeding it, preparing it." When Wexley resurfaced, he was covered in marks, rows of tiny punctures along his arms and neck. He died 3 days later. Cause of death: nervous system collapse due to unknown pathogen. The fire began in the north wing of St. Elora's Chapel, a silent, abrupt ignition that occurred on the very day the diocese dispatched an investigator to audit the parish's archives. Coincidence? Not in Blackridge Hollow. The investigator never made it inside. Locals reported that before the blaze, a strange fog descended upon the chapel grounds, dense, low-hanging, and acrid like burning hair. The bell tolled once at midnight, though no one had pulled a rope. Moments later, flames surged up through the floorboards of the records room. Nothing of the physical archive survived. Baptismal logs, burial records, land transfers, exorcism reports, reduced to dust. But that wasn't the end. What the fire left behind was far more disturbing. Beneath the altar, hidden beneath warped flagstones, emergency responders discovered the chapel's foundation stone cracked open by the heat. And in the ashes, etched in reverse, as if pressed by unseen fingers, were letters, charred but still legible. The message read, "Not gone, only sleeping. The roots remember the shape of blood." Father Rellard, the parish priest, was found outside the ruins the next morning. His hands were blackened, his eyes wide open, rolled upward. When questioned, he said nothing for several hours. Eventually, he spoke a single sentence. They buried the records because they feared what the names would awaken. What names? Wexley's recovered documents had made references to those born from soil, not sin. Names tied to birth dates that did not align with any recorded pregnancies. Mothers who swore they were barren. Children who bore the sigil of the hungering tree. A three-pronged fork burned faintly into their palms. But those names were destroyed. Or so they thought. Because weeks after the chapel fire, schoolteacher Meredith Pike, who had once taught the original Gorman children, received a letter. No return address. Inside was a list. 17 names. She recognized 5 of them as students who'd gone missing over a span of 40 years. The others? She had no idea until she looked in the town cemetery registry. Each name belonged to a grave that had never existed until it suddenly appeared. Tombstones freshly carved. Soil recently turned. No bodies beneath. Only roots. Meredith Pike was not known for superstition. She taught arithmetic, wrote letters in perfect calligraphy, and dismissed most town gossip as the mutterings of old men who drank too much. But after the chapel fire and the arrival of that nameless letter, something shifted in her. She began walking. Night after night, she left her lantern burning low and traced the edges of Blackridge Hollow's forgotten perimeter, the places where farm boundaries blurred into forest, where roads vanished into moss-covered trails. She was looking for what no one else dared speak aloud. Graves that didn't belong. At first, they were hard to find. No markers. No fences. Just subtle irregularities in the land. Soil slightly darker. Ground sunken in precise rectangles. But then, the stones began appearing. Each one was made of black slate. Each engraved with a name from the letter. And each stone hummed. Not loud. Not musical. But a low vibration felt through the soles of her shoes, as if the ground itself was whispering a memory. She mapped them. 17 graves, arranged in a spiral that wrapped around Blackridge Hollow like a serpent devouring its own tail. And at the center of that spiral, an oak tree. Old, twisted, its bark marked with crude carvings too deep and too uniform to be natural. At its base, a single unmarked grave. When Meredith stepped toward it, the humming stopped. She fell to her knees. Not from fear, but from a weight, an invisible force pressing against her shoulders, chest, even her breath. The moment she touched the earth, she felt it. A pulse. Faint. Slow. But steady. Something was alive down there. She fled, returning by daylight with local gravedigger Tom Ivers, who had worked the cemetery for 3 decades. When he lowered his spade into the soil and removed the first scoop, he froze. There was no dirt beneath. Only hair. Black. Thick. Human. And beneath that, soft flesh, warm like a sleeping child. Terrified, they covered it back up. Meredith later wrote, "Whatever was buried, there was never meant to be found by accident. The spiral is not decoration. It's a seal. The others are anchors. It sleeps because it is held. But someone is loosening the knots." The Breckenwalds had vanished from public life after the 1847 inquest. With most of the family presumed dead or institutionalized, their estates were divided and the land seized by the county. But one heir, Ellis Breckenwald, escaped the purge. The youngest son, born in secret, raised overseas and educated in Munich under the guise of another name, Erhard Lowe. In 1871, Ellis returned to Blackridge Hollow, not as a Breckenwald, but as an architectural consultant, backed by a quiet fortune and escorted by 6 German engineers fluent in tunneling, soil stabilization, and early electrical circuitry. The destination? The forested boundary just west of the spiral graves. The same spot where Meredith Pike felt the pulse beneath the earth. What they built was no simple foundation. It began with a false barn, wooden on the outside, but steel reinforced beneath. Locals noticed the hum of strange equipment echoing out of it at night, and some swore they saw blue light flickering through the floorboards, even though no lantern burns that color. Within months, the team dug a vertical shaft nearly 70 feet deep. The walls were lined with polished obsidian slabs etched in looping, serpentine symbols. Every 7 feet, they embedded iron rings into the stone, precisely spaced as if to mimic vertebrae. One worker described the tunnel as a spine carved into the body of the hollow. But it was what they found at the bottom that changed everything. A natural cavity, not man-made. Dry, silent, and in its center, a mound of tangled roots surrounding a pulsing mass the size of a coffin. Ellis called it the core memory. He claimed it predated the town, predated man, and that his family had been appointed, not chosen, to feed it memory, blood, and silence. One of the German engineers, Klaus Hinterfeld, kept a journal. His final entry, dated 2 days before his disappearance, reads, "It breathes and dream. I see my mother's face in the bark. She tells me things I never lived but somehow regret. It is not buried. It is remembering itself." Then came the storms. Thunder rolled for 3 weeks without lightning. Crops died. Cattle turned aggressive. And one by one, the graves in the spiral began to crack. IT started on the night of the 13th thunder. The sky boiled black, and Ellis Breckenwald, clad in a coat stitched with ritual markings and a belt made from plaited infant hair, descended into the shaft with one intention: to awaken what had been bound for centuries. He called it reanimation through resonance. A theory that if memory, bloodline, and sound were aligned just right, the core would not simply wake. It would remember the original purpose for which the hollow had been seeded. Inside the shaft, his engineers had assembled a ring of tuning forks cast from the family's heirloom silver, each one engraved with a specific name, those buried in the spiral. The room vibrated as they began to strike them one by one, in a calculated sequence Ellis claimed came from the breathing rhythm of the core itself. It was not music, it was language. As the resonance built, the core began to unravel. Roots withdrew from the stone like veins detaching from flesh. Steam hissed out, then the center split open, not with blood, with voices. Hundreds, male and female, young and old, some sobbing, some laughing, some whispering things no one understood, but everyone felt in their spine. One of the engineers tore off his clothes and screamed, it's me, I was buried twice," before leaping into the pit and vanishing. That was when the spiral cracked. All 17 graves exploded upward, the bodies beneath gone. replaced by perfectly clean, empty bone frames. And every mirror in Blackridge Hollow shattered simultaneously, even those wrapped in cloth or stored in cellars. What came next was not a storm. It was a release. Cattle walked backward. Infants were born with mouths full of teeth. Men lost time. A preacher murdered his entire flock during midnight mass, then preached to their corpses for hours before being restrained. Meredith Pike wrote in her diary, "The hollow isn't haunted. It's hungry." And Ellis didn't feed it. He reminded it that it existed. At sunrise, Ellis was gone. The shaft collapsed in on itself. The barn burned from the inside out, though no fire ever reached its walls. But the humming never stopped. When the U.S. Geological Survey received the first request to investigate Blackridge Hollow in 1882, it was under the pretense of unexplained seismic activity. The land was believed to be unstable, yet no records of recent fault lines or mining operations existed. What struck investigators immediately was that Blackridge Hollow didn't appear on any updated maps. Not federal, not state, not local. It was listed in tax documents until 1811. Land deeds were filed under Breckenwald Holdings as recently as 1849. But when cartographers attempted to overlay coordinates, they found nothing but blank forest. Surveyor Arnold C. Redden was dispatched with a team of 6, bringing detailed records, compasses, and rudimentary geophones. His field journal was recovered from a ravine 2 weeks later. Pages torn, waterlogged, and smeared with ash. What could be deciphered is chilling. August 3rd, we arrived at where the hollow should be. No clearing, no road, no ruins. Trees are strange. They bend toward us when we speak. Sound travels wrong. I can hear our footsteps 5 seconds after we take them. They camped beside a creek. That night, one team member, Jonah Willis, began choking in his sleep. His windpipe collapsed, yet no swelling, no obstruction. His eyes, Redden wrote, looked like they had seen something behind the stars. By the 4th day, their compasses spun constantly. Bearings reversed. The crew could see the sun, but it never seemed to rise or set. Time became circular. One member swore he had already lived the week twice. Another attempted to dig beneath a sycamore tree and uncovered what he described as a human jaw made of carved glass. The final entry from Redden reads, "There's something beneath us. Not a machine, not a beast, a memory that doesn't want to be forgotten. We're walking on its back, and the trees are its thoughts." The team was declared missing. No bodies were found. Only Redden's journal and a bundle of rotted twine wrapped around a child's milk tooth, left at the National Archives with no return address. Attempts to locate Blackridge Hollow today still fail. GPS systems stutter. Satellite images blur. Locals say if you enter the old road by accident, your engine dies, and you wake up in your own bed with a tooth in your palm. In the archives of the Royal Society of Psychogenic Sciences in Belgium, a short-lived organization disbanded in 1874 after a string of unexplained deaths. There sits a sealed collection marked non-causal correspondence. Blackridge Hollow, 1809 to 1812. These letters, written in trembling script, belonged to none other than Ellis Breckenwald himself. They were never mailed. Instead, the letters were discovered decades later, bundled in a rusted lockbox beneath the foundations of a collapsed Belgian manor house. The ink had not faded. The paper had not yellowed. And the seal bore a symbol, a coiled root spiraling into a human eye. Ellis's writings begin with urgency, but evolve into dread. He starts by begging the society for help, not funding, not equipment, containment. "I fear I've awakened something meant to be forgotten. Not a being, but an intention. Blackridge was built to keep it dreaming." He described the farm not as a home, but as a conduit, a focal point of resonance between the human nervous system and the deeper geological layers of the earth. Ellis believed that beneath the farm was a thinking structure, one older than any fossil, made of flesh that had forgotten what it once was. The Royal Society was interested, too interested. In one reply, recovered only in fragments, a Belgian scientist named Dr. Willem Eklund Hintz that similar structures have been located beneath the peat bogs of Zealand, and that rituals similar to those at Blackridge Hollow were found etched into prehistoric infant skulls in northern Norway. Ellis's final letter is brief. It was folded around a human finger bone. They want to excavate. I warned them not to come. They sent a team anyway. I received their luggage yesterday, burnt but untouched. Inside, I found one mirror, cracked in 7 places. The cracks form letters. My name. The Royal Society ceased all mention of Blackridge Hollow in their records the following year. All members of the excavation team died in separate incidents, 2 in fires, 1 in a sleepwalking fall from a clock tower, another from spontaneous tooth ejection. His molars forcefully expelled while still conscious. Even the Society's founder, Etienne Veyrat, went missing. His final recorded words were whispered to his nurse. I hear the field humming. We are growing beneath it. Her name was Isadora Breckenwald, born in 1922 under a false surname in rural Montana. She was never meant to be found. For years, she lived in quiet obscurity, homeschooled, unregistered, hidden by the last caretaker of the Breckenwald bloodline, an old war widow named Mavis Dreer. But by the time Isadora was 11, strange reports began trickling into regional health offices. Livestock near their property were found with teeth in their stomachs, not their own. Birds stopped migrating overhead, and one by one, neighbors abandoned their homes, claiming the air tasted like rusted nails and rotting milk. By age 17, Isadora had never menstruated. Her blood, tested in secret, carried triple-stranded DNA, an impossibility. Her heartbeat could not be detected with stethoscopes, only through seismic instruments. And in 1943, during a psychological examination, she described memories of events that hadn't happened yet, including the death of the president in 1963 and the Challenger explosion. The U.S. government took her in that same year, under Project Veilcrest, a classified biopsychoanomalous containment program operated beneath the guise of wartime medical research. In a sealed subterranean facility near Tucson, Arizona, she was studied under strict observation. Agents reported she would sit silently for hours, then whisper names of people who died minutes later across the country, names not yet released to the public. Doctors began to lose sleep. One researcher gouged out her own eyes after Isadora reportedly said, "You've seen enough of me already." Surveillance footage was never released. A declassified 1958 memo from the Department of Scientific Anomalies reads, Isadora is not human in the traditional sense. She is a biological echo, a reverberation of something old, something buried. Her genetics suggest that she was never conceived. She was grown or remembered. When asked about Blackridge Hollow, she would only say, "It didn't vanish. It folded." When pressed further, she began speaking in reverse, her voice matching the waveform patterns recorded in the hollow's soil during the 1882 expedition. In 1961, during a routine psych evaluation, she vanished. Her holding chamber was found open. There were no signs of escape, only a pool of teeth, and on the wall, drawn in blood. The farm dreams again. Satellite imagery shows nothing but an overgrown plot near what was once Blackridge Hollow. But locals say it's not the land that resists them, it's their minds. Pilots report navigational systems shorting out, maps distorted in the area, GPS pins relocate by themselves, and drones lose signal only to return with footage of non-existent buildings. Structures not seen since 1809. But the strangest discovery came in 1997, when a team of underground cartographers from the University of Edinburgh attempted a sonar scan beneath the original Breckenwald farm site. What they found was impossible. At a depth of nearly 300 feet, below shale and limestone that should have been undisturbed for millions of years, they detected a man-made foundation. Rectangular, multi-leveled, radiating heat, and from its core, a low-frequency sound, not geological, but rhythmic. A pattern, a pulse. Linguists were brought in. They confirmed the frequency translated to a phrase in Proto-Indo-European roots. "I'm still feeding." Days later, All 3 researchers vanished on their return flight. No wreckage was ever found. Then came the field agents, independent operatives hired by private security firms to uncover evidence of paranormal or biostructural anomalies beneath old-world sites. One such agent, Marcus Fell, entered Blackridge Hollow in 2004. He wore full biocontainment gear, Geiger counters, and neural inhibitors designed to block psychological influence. He lasted 43 minutes. When his body was recovered near a dry well, it was twisted backward, every bone inverted but unbroken. Clutched in his left hand was a mirror shard, and etched into his helmet's inner visor in his own handwriting were the words, "Do not listen when the field begins to speak." The land was fenced off shortly after, declared unstable and toxic by a privately funded environmental board. But those who live nearby still whisper of nights when the wind doesn't blow, but something hums, low, repetitive, like a nursery rhyme with no words. Some say they dream of children still living underground, digging, still blind, still whispering in a language that doesn't belong in this world. The reel is labeled simply, Footage, Hollow, 1938. It was discovered in a sealed tin box beneath the estate of former anthropologist Dr. Ellis Fenwick, whose entire collection was auctioned off after his unexplained suicide. What makes this reel terrifying is not its age, but the fact that it was never meant to be filmed. Blackridge Hollow was already restricted by 1938. Fences, warnings, armed guards. And yet someone, most likely Dr. Fenwick himself, slipped through and captured exactly 11 minutes and 13 seconds of silent black and white footage. The film shows overgrown brush, a collapsed barn, a dead horse curled unnaturally, its legs bent forward like a praying mantis. Then, at timestamp 5:42, the camera pans to the right. And just before the trees block the view, a child's arm is seen reaching out from the soil. Not rising, not moving, just there, as if it had been growing. But it's what happens in the final second that led to the film's classification as Level 6 anomalous media by global institutions. At 11:13, the camera tilts down suddenly, as if dropped. The frame becomes still, silent. Dust floats in the sunbeam. But in a single frame, barely detectable without slow-motion scan, there appears a figure in the center. No face, no clothing, no visible body, just a tall, distorted shape made entirely of teeth. Hundreds of teeth, human and not, bound together into something vaguely humanoid, as if the earth had tried to imitate a man using what it had swallowed. The reel was banned from public release. Analysts who reviewed it later suffered from violent auditory hallucinations. One technician was found mumbling. It walks between memory. It was never born. It remembers before time. That one frame now resides in a high-security archive under 7 different national jurisdictions. It is not allowed to be digitized. It is not allowed to be copied. And it is marked with a warning label that reads, "Do not view past frame 16103. Nothing exists after that, but it will pretend to." We end where it all began, a farm buried beneath centuries, secrets, and silence. But Blackridge Hollow was never just soil, never just livestock, never just a family with blood on their hands. It was a system, a gate, a whispering mechanism designed to consume children, rewire innocence, and rebuild something older than man. Let's ask the final question. What if the Breckenwald family didn't create the horror, but were chosen by it? What if they weren't serial killers in the traditional sense, but engineers of a ritual meant to sustain something buried deeper than bones? There are dozens of reports, never verified, of people who live near the area suddenly developing obsessive behaviors. Burrowing, collecting teeth, writing in languages not recorded in any archaeological database. They drew the same shapes. Always the same, a spiral jaw within a cube of flesh. These weren't random psychotics. These were scientists, midwives, priests, all reporting the same dreams of a barn that breathes, a song without sound, and a child's voice saying, "He grows best in darkness." Today, the area remains sealed. No one talks about it on record. The The land is owned by 8 shell companies that trace back to institutions with no names, just acronyms, initials, and black budgets. But occasionally, on cold nights, strangers have seen dim lights flicker beneath the ground. Not fire, not electricity, but a soft amber glow, like lanterns walking beneath the surface. And those brave, or foolish, enough to camp near the site say the dirt feels warmer than the air, like something massive and alive is breathing just below. Viewers, now we ask you, was Blackridge Hollow the site of a family's horror, or the beginning of something much older still waiting to return? Comment, he grows best in darkness, if you made it this far. Comment it twice, because once is never enough in places like this. This was DeadScroll. Like, share, subscribe, because the world you think you live in, it's nothing compared to what hides just beneath it. Stay awake, stay aware, and remember, they never left the farm.